Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something that a lot of people get wrong when it comes to love, relationships, and emotional connection. You're sitting there staring at your phone wondering, why hasn't he called? You're replaying conversations in your mind. You're checking old messages. You're looking for clues, signs, anything that can explain why the energy suddenly feels different. Just a few weeks ago, he was texting first. He was calling. He was making plans. He seemed excited. And now? Now he's quieter. Now he's taking longer to respond. Now it feels like something shifted. And naturally, your mind goes to the worst possible conclusion. He must be losing interest. He must be talking to someone else. He must not care anymore. But what if I told you that sometimes the exact opposite is true? What if the distance you're feeling isn't because he's emotionally checking out? What if it's because he's emotionally waking up? See, one of the biggest misunderstandings between men and women is that they often process emotional attachment very differently. Many women experience connection through communication. When they care, they want to talk. They want to share. They want to understand what's happening. But many men experience deep emotions through internal processing. When something significant happens emotionally, they don't always move toward people. Sometimes they move inward. And that's where confusion begins. Because from the outside, inward movement looks exactly like withdrawal. But internally, something completely different may be happening. A man who was comfortable when things were casual may suddenly become uncomfortable when feelings become real. Not because he doesn't want the connection, because now the connection actually matters. And whenever something matters, fear enters the picture. Think about it. Nobody gets nervous about losing something they don't care about. Nobody lies awake thinking about a future they don't want. Nobody becomes cautious about a heart they're planning to walk away from. Fear often shows up when value appears. And that's what many people miss. When a man begins to genuinely care about someone, he starts recognizing the possibility of loss. Before, everything felt simple. Now there are stakes. Before, he was enjoying the moment. Now he's imagining a future. Before, rejection would have been disappointing. Now, rejection would hurt. And suddenly, he's dealing with emotions he doesn't completely understand. You have to remember that many men were never taught how to process vulnerability in healthy ways. Growing up, they learned how to compete. They learned how to perform. They learned how to achieve. They learned how to survive. But very few were taught how to sit with fear. Very few were taught how to talk openly about emotional uncertainty. Very few were taught how to say, "I'm scared because this connection matters to me." So instead of expressing that fear directly, they often retreat into silence. Not because they don't feel enough. Sometimes because they feel too much. Now, let me be clear. Not every man who pulls back is falling in love. Sometimes, distance is exactly what it looks like. Sometimes, someone loses interest. Sometimes, someone lacks emotional maturity. Sometimes, someone simply isn't invested. That's reality. But we're talking about something different here. We're talking about the man whose behavior changes after genuine emotional connection develops. The man who stays present but becomes quieter. The man who doesn't disappear completely but suddenly seems more thoughtful. The man who remains in your world even while processing his feelings. There's a difference between absence and hesitation. And if you don't recognize that difference, you'll misread the situation every time. Because hesitation often comes from emotional significance. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The higher the cliff, the more carefully you move. Not because you're weak, not because you're incapable, but because the consequences matter. Love works the same way. When a man realizes he's no longer dealing with a casual connection, he becomes aware of emotional consequences. He realizes this woman could affect his life. He realizes she could hurt him. He realizes she could change him. He realizes she could become important. And that's when caution appears. That's when overthinking begins. That's when silence enters the picture. You know what's interesting? People often assume confidence eliminates fear. But that's not true. Some of the strongest men you'll ever meet are terrified when it comes to love. Not because they're weak, because love reaches places that success never touches. A man can be successful in business, confident in leadership, comfortable under pressure, respected by everyone around him, and still feel vulnerable when he starts caring deeply about one woman, because emotional exposure requires a different kind of courage. It's one thing to risk money. It's another thing to risk your heart. And for many men, that emotional risk feels unfamiliar. So they slow down. They think. They analyze. They question themselves. They replay conversations. They wonder whether they're ready. They wonder whether they're enough. They wonder whether this relationship could actually work. And during that process, they may appear distant. Meanwhile, the woman on the other side is asking completely different questions. Did I do something wrong? Did I say too much? Was I too available? Was I not available enough? Is he losing interest? And the tragic part is that both people are often worried about the same thing, getting hurt. One is pulling inward because he's scared. The other is becoming anxious because she's confused. Neither one is communicating what they're actually feeling, and that's how misunderstandings begin. The truth is, emotional connection changes people. It changes their behavior. It changes their priorities. It changes how they think. A man who wasn't worried before may suddenly become cautious. A man who wasn't serious before may suddenly start evaluating the future. A man who once acted effortlessly may suddenly become more intentional. And intentionality often looks different than excitement. Excitement is loud. Intentionality is quiet. Excitement rushes. Intentionality slows down. Excitement chases the feeling. Intentionality examines the reality. That's why some men become more reflective when they start falling. They're no longer asking, "Do I like her?" Now they're asking, "Can I build something real with her?" And that's a much bigger question. Because attraction is easy. Commitment requires responsibility. Connection requires trust. Love requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is where many men begin wrestling with themselves. Not because they don't want love, because they understand what love demands. The moment a relationship starts feeling meaningful, something shifts inside him. Suddenly, he's not just protecting his freedom. He's protecting his heart. He's protecting his future. He's protecting the parts of himself that very few people ever get access to. And before he hands someone that kind of access, he wants to be sure about his feelings, sure about his intentions, sure about the person standing in front of him. Because once a man genuinely opens his heart, there's no pretending anymore. There's no emotional armor left to hide behind. And for someone who's spent years being guarded, that can feel like standing exposed in a storm. That's why what looks like distance on the surface may actually be the beginning of a much deeper emotional journey underneath. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because once a man realizes that his feelings are becoming serious, he often enters a private battle that nobody else can see. On one side is desire. On the other side is fear. Desire tells him to move closer. Fear tells him to be careful. Desire says, this could be something incredible. Fear says, what if it falls apart? Desire imagines the future. Fear remembers the past. And for many men, those two voices start competing the moment love becomes real. You see, people often talk about heartbreak as something that happens after a relationship ends. But very few people talk about the fear that exists before a relationship even begins. The fear of investing. The fear of trusting. The fear of becoming emotionally dependent on someone. The fear of giving your heart to another human being and not knowing what they'll do with it. Every person who has ever loved deeply understands that fear, but many men don't know how to talk about it. So instead of discussing it openly, they carry it silently. That's why a man can genuinely care about you and still seem conflicted. Not because he's confused about who you are, but because he's wrestling with what loving you might require from him. Think about the walls people build throughout their lives. Those walls don't appear overnight. They're built one experience at a time, one disappointment at a time, one betrayal at a time, one heartbreak at a time. Every person carries scars. Every person carries memories. Every person carries lessons they learned the hard way. And when a man begins falling in love, those old experiences often come rushing back. Maybe he trusted someone before and got hurt. Maybe he opened up emotionally and was rejected. Maybe he gave everything he had and watched the relationship fall apart anyway. Now, suddenly, he's standing at the edge of another emotional investment. And part of him wants to jump, but another part remembers what happened the last time. That's why love isn't always excitement. Sometimes it's courage. Sometimes it's choosing to move forward despite uncertainty. Sometimes it's deciding that the possibility of connection is worth the risk of pain. And that decision doesn't happen instantly. For some men, it takes time. A lot more time than people realize. That's why patience becomes so important. Not passive waiting. not accepting poor treatment, not tolerating inconsistency forever, but understanding that meaningful, emotional processes often happen beneath the surface before they're visible on the outside. The strongest connections are rarely built overnight. They grow through trust. They grow through consistency. They grow through shared experiences. And trust, especially for someone who's been hurt before, develops slowly. A man who is beginning to see you as someone important often starts observing more carefully, not because he's looking for flaws, because he's looking for safety. Safety is something people don't talk about enough in relationships. Everyone talks about chemistry. Everyone talks about attraction. Everyone talks about compatibility. But emotional safety is what determines whether love survives. A man wants to know, can I be honest here? Can I be vulnerable here? Can I make mistakes here? Can I reveal parts of myself that nobody else sees? Can I trust this person with my truth? Those questions matter, and they matter even more when feelings become serious. Because casual relationships require very little vulnerability. Real relationships require a lot. It's easy to be confident when nobody can hurt you. It's much harder when someone has the power to break your heart. That's why some men become quieter as they become more invested. Not less invested. More invested. Every conversation carries more weight. Every interaction means more. Every possibility feels bigger. And bigger possibilities create bigger fears. Now, let me tell you something that many women don't realize. A man's silence isn't always about finding answers. Sometimes it's about finding courage. Because knowing how you feel and acting on how you feel are two completely different things. A man may already know he cares. He may already know he wants something serious. He may already know that you're different. But acting on those realizations requires courage. It requires vulnerability. It requires risk. And risk is where many people hesitate. Not because they don't want the reward, because they understand the cost. Love asks people to remove their armor. It asks them to stop pretending they're invincible. It asks them to trust someone with the parts of themselves they've spent years protecting. That's a big ask, especially for someone who's built his identity around strength and self-reliance. So while you're wondering why he's quieter, he may be asking himself questions like, am I ready for this? Can I be the partner she deserves? Can I handle the responsibility that comes with a real relationship? Can I show up consistently? Can I trust myself not to repeat old mistakes? Notice something important. Those questions aren't about your worth. They're about his readiness. And that's a distinction that changes everything. Because when people internalize another person's hesitation, they often assume they're the problem. They assume they're not attractive enough, not interesting enough, not valuable enough. But many times, the hesitation has very little to do with them. It's an internal conversation happening inside the other person. A conversation about fear. A conversation about growth. A conversation about responsibility. A conversation about whether they're prepared for the next chapter of their lives. And here's another truth. The closer a relationship gets to becoming real, the harder it becomes to fake confidence. In the early stages, everyone looks certain. Everyone looks smooth. Everyone looks composed. But genuine emotional connection exposes insecurities. It exposes fears. It exposes unresolved wounds. It exposes the parts of ourselves we've been hiding. That's why some of the strongest relationships begin with moments of uncertainty. Not because the connection is weak, because it's strong enough to challenge both people. A man who is emotionally invested starts thinking beyond attraction. He's no longer focused solely on how you make him feel today. He's thinking about tomorrow. He's thinking about next year. He's thinking about compatibility, values, trust, and long-term potential. And those thoughts naturally slow people down, because serious decisions deserve serious consideration. Now, does that mean every period of distance should be excused? Absolutely not. Healthy relationships still require communication. Healthy relationships still require effort. Healthy relationships still require accountability. But understanding why someone may temporarily withdraw emotionally can prevent unnecessary panic. Because panic often creates problems that weren't there to begin with. When people become afraid, they sometimes chase reassurance. They push for answers. They demand clarity before the other person has processed their own feelings. And while that's understandable, it can sometimes increase pressure on someone who's already overwhelmed. What many emotionally mature people learn is how to remain centered during uncertainty. They learn not to interpret every shift as rejection. They learn not to make permanent conclusions from temporary behavior. They learn to observe patterns instead of reacting to moments. And that kind of emotional stability creates something powerful. It creates space. Space for honesty. Space for growth. Space for people to understand what they're feeling. Because beneath all the confidence, all the strength, all the independence, there is often a simple question hiding in his heart. If she sees the real me, will she stay? And that question is about to influence everything he does next. Because real love doesn't grow under pressure. It grows in an environment where two people feel safe enough to be genuine. And for a man who is beginning to lower his guard, that safety can mean everything. And that question is about to influence everything he does next. Because once a man begins asking himself, if she sees the real me, will she stay? The relationship enters an entirely different stage. Up until this point, most of what you've seen has been the version of him that feels safe to show the world. The confident version, the capable version, the strong version, the version that knows how to keep things together, the version that appears calm even when life gets messy. But real love has a way of reaching beneath all of that. It starts pulling people beyond the image they've carefully built. And that's where vulnerability begins. See, most people want intimacy, but very few understand what intimacy actually requires. Intimacy is not just spending time together. It's not just chemistry. It's not just attraction. Real intimacy is being fully seen. And being fully seen is one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can have. Because When someone truly sees you, they also see your imperfections. They see your insecurities. They see your fears. They see your wounds. They see the parts of you that don't feel polished or impressive. And that's exactly why many men struggle when love becomes serious. For years, they may have built their identity around being dependable, successful, strong, or emotionally controlled. Then, suddenly, someone comes along who makes them want to be known on a deeper level. Now, they're facing a choice. Keep the armor on, or risk taking it off. And that's not an easy decision. Because armor exists for a reason. People don't build emotional walls because they're happy. They build them because they've been hurt. Some men learned early in life that vulnerability wasn't safe. Maybe they were told to toughen up. Maybe they were mocked when they expressed emotion. Maybe they trusted someone who later betrayed them. Maybe they loved someone who walked away. Whatever the reason, they learned that emotional exposure comes with consequences. So, they adapted. They became self-reliant, independent, guarded, careful, and for a while, those strategies worked until they met someone who made them want more. Someone who made distance feel lonely. Someone who made emotional safety seem possible. Someone who made them consider lowering their guard. That's when things get complicated. Because the heart wants connection, but the mind remembers pain. The heart says, move closer. The mind says, protect yourself. And those two forces begin pulling in opposite directions. This is why a man may start revealing pieces of himself slowly, not all at once, not in dramatic speeches, but in moments, little moments, moments that are easy to miss if you're only looking for grand gestures. Maybe he tells you something personal about his childhood. Maybe he shares a fear he normally keeps hidden. Maybe he admits a mistake he's ashamed of. Maybe he talks about a dream he's never shared with anyone else. Those moments matter more than many people realize. Because, for a guarded man, vulnerability isn't casual. It's intentional. Every personal detail he shares is a form of trust. Every emotional truth he reveals is a step forward. Every wall he lowers is evidence that he's allowing you closer. And here's something important. A man's vulnerability often doesn't look the way people expect. Many people imagine vulnerability as tears, emotional speeches, or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't. Sometimes vulnerability is simply honesty. Sometimes it's admitting uncertainty. Sometimes it's saying, I don't know. Sometimes it's asking for support. Sometimes it's revealing a weakness. Sometimes it's letting someone see him during a difficult season, instead of disappearing until everything is fixed. Those moments may seem small, but they're significant because they represent trust, and trust is the foundation of everything meaningful. You know what's interesting? Many people spend so much time looking for signs that someone loves them that they miss the signs, that someone trusts them. But trust often comes first, before deep commitment, before emotional declarations, before long-term plans. Trust. And when a man begins trusting you, his behavior starts changing in subtle ways. He includes you in decisions. He asks for your opinion. He values your perspective. He wants to know what you think. Not because he needs permission, because your voice matters to him. Your presence matters. Your influence matters. Your role in his life is becoming more significant. And that's when another shift happens. He stops thinking only about how the relationship affects him. He starts thinking about how his choices affect you. That's a huge step, because emotionally immature people think primarily about themselves. Emotionally invested people begin thinking about the partnership. How will this decision affect her? How will these actions impact the relationship? How can I support her better? How can I show up more consistently? Those questions don't come from obligation. They come from care, and care changes behavior. Now, does that mean he'll suddenly become perfect? Of course not. Nobody does. Love doesn't eliminate flaws. It exposes them. In fact, one of the most surprising parts of falling in love is realizing that your imperfections don't disappear. They become more visible, because relationships shine light into places that were previously hidden. A man who seemed confident may discover insecurities. A man who seemed fearless may discover anxieties. A man who appeared emotionally detached may realize he cares more deeply than he expected. And all of those discoveries require adjustment. That's why growth and love often happen simultaneously. The deeper the connection becomes, the more opportunities there are for self-reflection. The more opportunities there are for healing. The more opportunities there are to become a better version of yourself. A good man doesn't just ask whether he wants the relationship. Eventually, he starts asking whether he's becoming the partner the relationship deserves. That's maturity. That's growth. That's emotional responsibility. And it doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it happens through mistakes. Sometimes it happens through difficult conversations. Sometimes it happens through uncomfortable realizations. But it happens, especially when the connection is meaningful, because meaningful relationships inspire growth. They challenge complacency. They encourage honesty. They reveal strengths and weaknesses alike. And as a man moves through that process, one thing becomes increasingly clear. His feelings are no longer hypothetical. They're real. He can no longer dismiss them. He can no longer pretend they don't exist. He can no longer keep one foot in and one foot out. Sooner or later, every emotionally invested man reaches a crossroads. A moment where he must decide whether fear will lead his future or whether love will. Because no amount of analysis can fully eliminate risk. No amount of thinking can guarantee success. No amount of caution can prevent vulnerability. At some point, if he wants the relationship, he has to step forward. He has to trust. He has to take the chance. And when that moment arrives, you'll begin noticing something powerful. The hesitation starts fading. The uncertainty starts shrinking. The mixed signals start disappearing. And something much stronger begins taking their place. Intentionality. Because once a man decides that you're worth the risk, his focus shifts completely. He's no longer evaluating the possibility. He's preparing to build the reality. And that's where everything changes. And that's where everything changes. Because once a man decides you're worth the risk, something inside him settles. The internal battle that once consumed his thoughts begins to quiet down. The constant questioning starts fading. The hesitation that once slowed him down loses its grip. And for the first time, his actions begin to align with what his heart has been feeling all along. This is the stage that many people never talk about. Everyone talks about attraction. Everyone talks about chemistry. Everyone talks about the chase. But very few people talk about what happens when a man makes a decision. Because real love isn't built on feelings alone. It's built on decisions. A feeling can change from one day to the next. A decision creates consistency. A feeling can be influenced by circumstances. A decision creates commitment. A feeling says, I care about her. A decision says, I'm going to show up for her. And when a man reaches that point, you don't have to spend all your time decoding his behavior. You don't have to analyze every text. You don't have to wonder where you stand. Because clarity begins replacing confusion. That's one of the strongest signs of genuine emotional investment. Not perfection. Clarity. A man who has decided he wants you doesn't leave you constantly guessing. He doesn't create endless uncertainty. He doesn't keep one foot inside the relationship and one foot outside. Instead, he begins creating stability. Not because he's suddenly fearless, but because his desire for the relationship becomes stronger than his fear of vulnerability. Think about that for a moment. The fear doesn't always disappear. The risk doesn't disappear. The possibility of getting hurt doesn't disappear. What changes is that he decides the connection is worth those risks. And that decision transforms his behavior. Now he starts showing up differently. Not because someone told him to, not because he's trying to impress you, because he genuinely wants to. He starts becoming more intentional with his time, more intentional with his communication, more intentional with his presence. You begin noticing that he follows through on what he says. If he promises to call, he calls. If he makes plans, he keeps them. If he says he'll be there, he shows up. Those things may sound simple, but consistency is one of the purest expressions of care. Anybody can say beautiful words. Anybody can make promises. Anybody can create excitement for a short period of time. But consistency requires character. Consistency requires effort. Consistency requires emotional maturity. And when a man is serious about you, consistency becomes one of the ways he communicates his feelings. Because he wants you to feel secure. He wants you to trust him. He wants his actions to remove doubt instead of creating it. That's what emotionally mature love looks like. Not endless intensity. Not constant drama. Not emotional roller coasters. Reliability, trust, presence. Those things may not be as flashy as grand romantic gestures, but they create something much more valuable. They create safety. And safety is where real love grows. You know, a lot of people spend years searching for excitement while overlooking stability. They confuse unpredictability with passion. They confuse inconsistency with mystery. They confuse emotional chaos with love. But healthy love doesn't leave you emotionally exhausted all the time. Healthy love brings peace. It creates confidence. It allows both people to relax into the relationship instead of constantly fighting to hold on to it. That's why, when a good man truly falls in love, his goal isn't to make your life more complicated. It's to make your life better. He wants to contribute. He wants to support. He wants to build. Not because he feels obligated, because he cares. And when care becomes genuine, it naturally seeks expression. You'll notice him paying attention to details, not because he's trying to earn points, because what matters to you starts mattering to him. The things that make you smile become important. The things that stress you become important. Your goals become important. Your happiness becomes important. Your well-being becomes important. That's what happens when someone starts viewing life through the lens of partnership. It's no longer just about me. It becomes us. And that shift changes everything. Now, here's something many people need to hear. A man who truly loves you isn't just interested in being loved by you. He's interested in loving you well. There's a difference. Some people focus entirely on what they can receive, how much attention they're getting, how much validation they're receiving, how much affection is coming their way. But real love asks a different question. How can I contribute to this person's life? How can I support their growth? How can I protect their peace? How can I make them feel valued? Those questions reflect emotional maturity, and emotionally mature love is what creates lasting relationships. Because eventually, attraction alone isn't enough. Chemistry alone isn't enough. Feelings alone aren't enough. What sustains a relationship over time is the willingness of two people to continue choosing each other day after day, conversation after conversation, challenge after challenge. And that's where commitment lives. Not in a single romantic moment, not in a dramatic declaration, but in daily decisions, daily effort, daily presence. That's why the strongest relationships aren't necessarily the ones that started perfectly. They're the ones where both people kept showing up, kept learning, kept growing, kept choosing each other, even when it wasn't easy, especially when it wasn't easy, because love isn't proven when everything is going well. Love reveals itself during difficult moments, when misunderstandings happen, when stress appears, when life becomes complicated, when circumstances aren't ideal. That's when character becomes visible. That's when commitment becomes real. And a man who has truly fallen in love understands something important. Love isn't just a feeling you experience. It's a responsibility you embrace. It's a promise you protect. It's a connection you nurture. Not because you have to, because you want to. And when a man reaches that level of understanding, his love becomes visible in ways that words alone can never capture. You see it in his consistency. You see it in his effort. You see it in his patience. You see it in his willingness to communicate. You see it in his desire to grow. You see it in the way he continues choosing the relationship even after the excitement of the beginning fades, because that's when real love begins. Not when butterflies are strongest, not when everything feels new, but when two people decide to stay present after the novelty wears off, when they continue investing, when they continue caring, when they continue building. And that's why it's so important not to judge every moment of silence as rejection. Not every pause means someone is leaving. Not every hesitation means someone is losing interest. Sometimes people are processing. Sometimes people are growing. Sometimes people are gathering the courage necessary to become the partner they want to be. And sometimes the very thing you're worried about is actually the beginning of something deeper than you imagined. So, if you find yourself wondering why his behavior changed, don't immediately assume the worst. Pay attention to the full picture. Look at the pattern. Look at the effort. Look at the consistency. Look at the direction of his actions over time. Because real men don't always announce their feelings with perfect words. Sometimes they communicate through presence, through growth, through vulnerability, through commitment, and ultimately through consistency. That's when you know the difference between a man who enjoys your attention and a man who values your heart. One enjoys the moment. The other builds a future. One appears when it's convenient. The other remains when it matters. One talks about possibilities. The other creates reality. And when a man reaches that point, when fear no longer leads him, when trust becomes stronger than doubt, and when his actions begin matching the feelings he's carried inside for so long, that's no longer a man wondering whether he's falling. That's a man who already has. And now he's finally ready to love you the way he's wanted to all along.